hope is definitely a driving force. I think though more than even hope though is because everything that we've talked about today took a long time, 10 years, 15 years, 20 years from start to sort of hopefully happy conclusion. And what you have to really celebrate along the way are the incremental victories, even if they're small, because that's what keeps you going, right? You take the incremental victories, and then when you get the big giant victory, that's when I think you actually need the humility, right? And to be humble, because you work so hard for so long, you celebrate all the incremental victories, and then when the good thing finally happens, you're like, wow. I think no one should ever be at that point where I deserve it. They should be in awe that they've made it that far, personally.
Have you ever noticed that some of the best ideas come from unexpected places? Your next breakthrough may come from a leader facing similar challenges, but in a completely different sector. Welcome to Chief Influencer. I'm your host, Anthony Shop. Join us as we explore how today's successful leaders inspire, influence, and connect with others. Chief Influencer is a production of Social Driver and the Communications Board, who have teamed up to spotlight how great leaders and communicators are making their impact in the world. This episode is brought to you by the George Washington University's College of Professional Studies. With in-person and online programs, ranging from master's degrees in public relations strategy to certificate programs in digital communications, GW offers more than just the credentials to help working professionals get ahead. It prepares them to be leaders in their field. As a proud GW graduate myself, I can attest that faculty members combine academic rigor with real-world lessons that can't always be found in textbooks. Check out cps.gwu.edu for more information. I am thrilled to introduce today's guest, Michael Manganiello. A born advocate, Michael believes in the power of the patient to impact major changes in health policy, a power that's amplified when groups unite around a common agenda. He founded Pyxis Partners as a firm that not only can access major stakeholders in the healthcare community, but can bring them together and find common ground to advance positive change. Before we dive in, there's 3 things I think you should know about Michael. Number 1, Michael's lived with HIV for 40 plus years, and this has deeply impacted his lens for medical research and patient advocacy over that time. After his diagnosis, Michael participated in clinical trials led by Dr. Anthony Fauci, which saved the lives of many people living with HIV, including Michael's, and is a testament to the profound impact of dedicated medical research on individual lives. Ultimately, it is said that one of the most significant successes of Michael's decades of work in the health equity, advocacy, and health policy communities was his role in giving people living with HIV/AIDS something that they had previously struggled to find: hope. Number 2, Michael has an impressive track record of building effective coalitions within the healthcare community. Tapped as the first senior vice president of government relations for the Christopher and Dana Reeve Foundation, he played an integral role in establishing the foundation as a leading force for advancing medical research and improving quality of life for the mobility impaired. Among his successes, Michael secured introduction and passage of the Christopher and Dana Reeve Paralysis Act, which became law in 2009, and raised more than $150 million for the Christopher and Dana Reeve Paralysis Resource Center. Number 3, Michael lends his professional expertise to organizations that support his passions, such as art. He currently serves on the board of trustees for the Leslie Lohman Museum of Gay and Lesbian Art, the only dedicated art museum in the world to exhibit and preserve artwork that speaks about the LGBTQ experience. Michael, you have been called many things, from a born advocate to a champion of LGBTQ equality, board member, business leader, coalition builder. Today, we are thrilled to call you a chief influencer. Welcome.
Thank you, Anthony. It's nice to be here speaking with you, though you've been a little hyperbolic. I don't know if I'm all those things, but thank you.
Well, look, I have to say, I'm really inspired by the work that you've done. I know a lot of people are. I think we can look at our country and say that it is a better place because of the advocacy work that you've done in your life. So thank you for that.
You're welcome.
And I just want to start, many listeners, they may have seen you on the silver screen recently. You were heavily featured in the new documentary, Superman, the Christopher Reeve story. And for those who haven't seen it, I wonder if you could just start off by talking about how you worked alongside Christopher and Dana Reeve to change public policy.
Sure. So I met Chris's wife, Dana, in the mid 80s in New York. We were actually waiters together. We were in the theater together, and she then went off to do theater in up in Williamstown, Mass, and met somebody, called and said I met somebody, and I was like, well, of course you have. She was beautiful and talented and young, and little did I know that she had met Superman, and yeah, it was kind of a shocking. And anyway, they were together 20 years, but our lives were different directions. I owned a restaurant. She continued with her career. She married Chris, but then I got sick, and they were supportive all along. Many times when I would get sick, they would come to the hospital and take me home and make sure I was okay, and along with lots of other support. But then luckily I got into that one trial in particular, which was the protease inhibitor, the cocktail, which was the intervention that Dr. Fauci came up with that is now made HIV/AIDS a chronic manageable illness. When I was diagnosed, it was a death sentence. Yeah. So that's a huge leap in one's lifetime to see that happen. It's really miraculous. So anyway, after I got sick and got better, Chris had the accident, and they called me and asked me if I could come help them. And I said I'd be happy to. While Chris had been very philanthropic and active in all kinds of issues, medical research was not one of them. Now, I had a lot of experience at that point with the NIH and ACT UP and advocacy around research and HIV/AIDS. So it was nice to be able to introduce him to the work of the NIH. And that's where we merged. And then for the next 10 years, we started the foundation, and we went on to do a fair amount of change the world stuff. It was really an astounding decade for me. And then he died, and then 18 months later, his wife died tragically. And then I started my own firm and was able to, luckily, for almost my entire career at this firm, been able to work with the kind of clients I want to work with, meaning that they have the same values that I have. And so I've been able to be picky. And so we work with good guy clients that really care about health equity and really care about making sure people have equitable access to healthcare or drugs or whatever the case may be, equitable access to clinical trials and all that stuff. So, but that's how we initially met. The movie came about. I got a call about 2.5 years ago asking if I would be participating in this documentary. Chris's and Dana's 3 children had agreed to do it. So I said, I'd be happy to do it. I did tell them, though, I said, I'm happy to do it. I don't want to do a puff piece. Chris and Dana were amazing, but they were humans like everybody else. And they said, no, we really want honesty. And they actually did what I asked. And it's a really moving, honest piece about a man who was faced with terrible challenges, amazing opportunities, and then terrible challenges, and how he sort of navigated it. But for me personally, I was at the opening in about a month ago in New York at the Museum of Modern Art. To see this film kind of closed a circle for me on a whole part of my life that was the work that Chris and Dana and I did together. So it's been gratifying. Nationwide theaters right now, everybody, whoever wants to go see it.
And it's gotten some really great press.
Yeah.
It's getting really wonderful reviews.
Yes, it really has. It just opened in London yesterday, I think. So they deserved it, and it deserves it. And it's not only a movie about their lives, it's also a movie about, believe it or not, more than just Chris as Superman, and Chris as this iconic guy that's had a terrible injury that, was so ironic, him being Superman, then paralyzed from the neck down. The latter half of the movie really is about advocacy and change and Washington and medical research. And so there's a lot of lessons to be learned from watching this film.
Yeah, I think it'll be inspiring for a lot of people who, want to do something to make a difference, but then they don't know necessarily where to start. And, I wanted to ask you, so one of the quotes I came across, something that you said was this: there was no problem that was insurmountable to Christopher Reeve. He likened his work to that of John F. Kennedy and the moonshot. And, I know it's not easy to get others on board with like a really big goal, something that seems impossible. And I wonder if you could talk a little bit about how you all did that and maybe what, they learned from you, from the experiences you brought, maybe some of the things that you learned from them as you worked together to, achieve some big
Yes.
outcomes.
Yes. I think what they learned from me, or I think, I don't know if it was a lesson or a way to navigate things, was I was presented with an insurmountable problem. I was given 18 months to live. And what they saw through the work of ACT UP, which was our big activist organization that raised a lot of awareness. Some of it involved going to jail, but that's okay. I'm not advocating going to jail. We blocked bridges. I mean, terrible. Yeah. But we got attention is what we got. And so I think they saw some of these things, right? They saw, insurmountable problem, but we got attention. And then once we got the attention, we started to get people standing up and acting as leaders. And that would be like Dr. Fauci and certain people in the House and Senate who were funding a disease that was so stigmatized that nobody cared. Nobody cared that gay men were dying. They didn't care. But there were people that did. And so they saw that. And they saw that there was an accountability that's also really important. Anyway, the whole point is they saw that I lived and they saw that I surmounted it. And so I think that's some of the lessons that perhaps they took from my life experience. The lessons I took from them were incredible grace and dignity in the face of terrible, terrible injuries, diagnosis, prognosis. Whether it was Dana's stage 4 lung cancer or it was Chris's ventilated quadriplegia, they remained they rose above themselves a little bit. Don't get me wrong. Chris wanted out of that chair and Dana certainly didn't want to die of lung cancer, but they also realized that because of their position that they had a megaphone and they used it to try to help other people. And so, I think identifying that you sometimes need more than just attention. You need someone who can make a call to arms, a call to action. And I think that's where Chris decided to take the President Kennedy's moonshot. Because when President Kennedy said, I'm going to get to the moon in, I forget what it was, 5 years or 10 years, whatever he said, we knew how to take off. We knew how to get to them. We knew how to get out of our atmosphere, get to the moon. We didn't know how to land.
Yeah.
And 300,000 people later, and millions of dollars, they came up with a LEM and it landed on the moon and a man walked on the moon. That's what Chris saw, an insurmountable problem. But you had to set goals. You had to set sort of, really, you had to set tough kind of an end game that people needed to rise up to make it. So anyway, that's where that moonshot came. He used it constantly though.
Yeah. Well, Superman, it's not the first documentary that you were featured in, by the way.
No.
You were also featured in Fauci, which follows Dr. Anthony Fauci's career fighting epidemics from HIV/AIDS to COVID-19. And from what I understand, after your own diagnosis, you participated in clinical trials led by Dr. Fauci. I wonder if you could talk about how that experience not only just energized your work, but also how it helped you serve as a credible, trusted messenger to policymakers and the medical community and the public.
That's a really good question. So clinical research is, for someone who was given a diagnosis like me, there were no choices, right? Yeah. Clinical trials were the only hope we had. But not everyone believes in clinical research. People are nervous and scared of clinical trials. And so it was a little bit of a lesson early on. I learned that you do have to, the scientists, the NIH, the scientists, the researchers have to establish trust with the people that they want to enroll in these trials. And they don't always do that. And to this day, it really is an industry that's built around a certain demographic. And that demographic is not people of color. It's not women. It's not. And so it was an interesting sort of lens for me to look at clinical research. But I was lucky and I was proud to be in the clinical trial. And I went through a bunch of failed trials that were really brutal, but I knew it was my only shot. And it ultimately led to that final clinical trial. And I was really sick when I did that final one in 1995. And I got the call. I was living in New York, and they said, "We think we have something." I was like, "Okay." And I went down, and it was the protease. And in 1 week, my life turned around. I went from I was a viral millionaire. They measured your viral count back then, and yours is zero. Mine was in the millions. Mine is now zero. And mine started to decline. My T cells started to go up, and all of a sudden, I had life again. It was unbelievable. I mean, it took me 7 or 8 or 9 months to get my strength back, but it so cemented me forever to the idea that medical research, clinical research, development of new drugs and devices by scientists is the answer to our future of good health. So,
and I guess I'm thinking, you've done so much work for different patient advocacy causes. And maybe you can say more about just your own experience going through that and how that's helped you empathize with patients, how that's helped you connect with policymakers through your own story. Because it's hard for me, and I'm sure many of us, to imagine what that's like, Michael, to say you have 18 months to live and just sort of coming to terms with that. And then, having just such a turnaround with that. And it seems like, versus a traditional lobbyist or, somebody who studied political science, they were interned on the Hill, they went through the normal thing. You have a very different journey to advocacy and public policy.
Yeah, patient advocacy writ large is a different journey than lobbying on the Hill for whatever other cause, a regulation around the environment, whatever it may be. The beauty of the patient advocacy movement is that you're able to tell stories, and members of Congress and members of federal agencies, they can relate to a story. So you bring a little kid in who learned to inject himself with insulin before he learned to tie his shoes. That will leave a forever memory on a member of Congress. And you have won a member of Congress to your cause. You bring a little kid in a wheelchair in who's been told he's never going to walk again. That's going to influence, and you're going to win a champion, because that's how you have to have champions in Congress on both sides of the aisle, or you're not going to get anything done. And so we learned to have our advocates tell stories, no matter what your disease was. Some were easier than others, but telling the story is the answer. Because what you find on Capitol Hill is, and we would actually do research around this a little bit. Every member of Congress either has some kind of disease or illness, or a family member does. And by the way, everyone's going to get something.
Right.
Literally everyone is going to get a disease. So if you can sort of tap into that and get members of Congress to think in the long game, that's how you increase funding for medical research, or that's how you increase access to care, or that's how you get people to start figuring that early diagnosis is the answer and can save lives. And so you got to put a story on it. You got to put a face on everything.
I want to dive into that a little more. Let me ask, so as you've already mentioned, your work as an advocate began long before you joined the Christopher Dana Reeve Foundation. For the 30th anniversary of the discovery of HIV, just the virus that causes AIDS, you wrote a report called Back to Basics, HIV/AIDS Advocacy as a Model for Catalyzing Change, really taking some of the learnings from that experience that can be applied to other advocacy and patient advocacy efforts. I want to read a little excerpt from it that kind of addresses some of the different stakeholders. So here's the excerpt. Change is possible, but in order to create change, the focused voices of advocates must be heard through the din. Individuals and organizations must do the hard work of becoming ready to question the status quo and be smart enough to present well-founded alternatives. Strong leaders in government must pave the path and prepare to stay the course. Specific strategies with clear goals must be established in order to hold people accountable. So, to change public policy, you have to influence a lot of different stakeholders. It's not just enough to get one lawmaker on your side. And I wonder, you gave some examples of, bringing a patient, bringing a young person who, kid who's injecting themselves with insulin, learned to do that before they tied their shoes. obviously that type of storytelling is so powerful. But I wanted to talk a little bit more about the effective ways to influence policymakers and those people who influence policymakers as well.
Yeah, I've talked about the advocacy pyramid, and I think I actually talked about it in that report. I think what you need are a couple of things. I think you asked the right question. It's not just influencing one-on-one the policymaker, it's influencing the people who influence the policymakers. And sometimes that's the scientist, sometimes that's the academic research institution in their district, because that's what they care about. They care about their constituents, right? So you have to influence the constituents that they listen to, where medical research is part of what they're interested in. So what I think I know what we did with HIV/AIDS is we realized that if we were going to speak and influence, we had to be super smart about HIV/AIDS, because otherwise the status quo can be very dismissive, of you and what your cause is, because they're just like, well, you don't know what you're talking about, and this isn't how it works, and this isn't how. So in this triangle, the very tippity top of the triangle, and I'm not kidding, it was about 20 people in the nation, none of who had PhDs, none of who were scientists, but got as smart as scientists. They knew every nuance of the HIV virus, of clinical research, of what worked and what didn't. And then the pyramid goes down. And so I was at the bottom. I was like one of the little, the worker bees. We did the protesting. We got the attention, but it all went back up to the tippity top. And that's actually what influenced Dr. Fauci. He actually encountered us. Well, we were, smoke bombing the campus of the NIH and the FDA. He talks about finding a flyer we had left on the lawn of the NIH, and he picked it up and started looking at what our tenets were to our philosophy of medical research. And he's like, you know what, some of this makes sense. And so he invited some of these advocates in to the NIH. And let me tell you, his team wasn't happy about it. They did not want to talk to the people that were calling them murderers. But Dr. Fauci was smarter than that. He saw sort of the global picture of this whole thing and realized how smart that little tippity top of that pyramid was, and sat down with these advocates, and together they developed clinical trial designs that worked better than they would have if it had just been the scientists. Because if you don't listen to the patient, it's about the patient. Patient lives the experience. The patient is the one that has to, and it was so effective. And I would posit I wouldn't be standing here if those conversations hadn't occurred early on. And I look at it now, I look at the patient advocacy community over the last 20 years and how smart advocates have become. And you can go into the Energy and Commerce Committee or the, Health Committee, and you're talking to really smart people, but our people are smart too. And when they find out there's a respect that starts to happen, and they're like, oh, wait, these people, and then you become a resource too to the members of Capitol Hill or the federal agencies or the NIH or the FDA or the CDC. And that's how change starts to happen, is you prove yourself that you are you know what you're talking about, and that you can actually help solve this problem, not only for yourself, but for the member of Congress and for their constituents. And once they realize that, the conversation usually changes.
I was really surprised when I saw the Fauci documentary, because, I just wasn't as up as I should have been on the history of what happened at that time, and how the effects of activists like yourself, how effective that work was. And also, though, it reinforced something that we've heard from several other guests on Chief Influencer about the two-way nature of influence. So obviously, Dr. Fauci had a lot of influence, but he allowed himself to be influenced by the folks like you described at the bottom of the pyramid, who were, ACT UP and activists, and against the, the best, I guess, intentions of his own team that didn't want these folks to be included. But he sort of changed directions there. And by doing that, it really changed the conversation, and it made a big impact, and it expanded, clinical trials to people who had been given a really difficult prognosis. And so I wonder if you could just maybe talk a little bit more about the two-way influence piece there.
Well, part of it was because we as a unit of people living with HIV/AIDS were able to influence Dr. Fauci where he saw the synergies. There was a it wasn't a trickle down, it was kind of an explosion, because not only did Dr. Fauci he told the NIH, you're going to be working with these advocates on trial design and you're going to listen to what their concerns are and what's important to them. It also started trickling over to like pharmaceutical industry, and all these other academic research institutions were like, oh, Dr. Fauci is listening to these crazy people. And all of a sudden others started that, you know what I mean? But you need leadership. You need someone strong to stand up and be a leader. And that's what he was. And when that starts to happen, Dr. Fauci changed the paradigm completely of medical research and the relationship between patient advocacy and patient advocates and the medical research enterprise.
For folks who haven't, I definitely recommend them checking out Back to Basics. I think it's on the Pyxis website. Those 5 pillars, I know we don't have time to talk through kind of the entire thing, but are number 1, getting attention. Number 2, gathering knowledge and solutions. Number 3, organized community engagement efforts. Number 4, holding scientists and government agencies accountable. And then number 5, identifying true leaders.
Yes.
And I want to ask a little bit about that. There's a quote in the report from Peter Staley from ACT UP, and he said, there were real nerdy geeks who just salivated over becoming experts on the most obscure minutia of immunology and virology. And then there were a few big picture people like me. And I was going to ask you, in your own advocacy work, how important has it been to orchestrate sort of the policy experts alongside the big picture communicators and the activists and the fundraisers? Because to me, it seems like a very difficult tapestry to weave to get all those people sort of coordinated with one another. But that was done pretty well. And I guess that might be part of number 5, identifying true leaders.
Yeah, it's not as hard as you think, Anthony, really, because you have a group of people, they all have the same end game. They want an intervention with whatever their disease is. So with spinal cord injury, we would bring 100 people with wheelchairs. 100 people with wheelchairs on Capitol Hill is a lot of wheelchairs.
Yeah.
It gets attention and causes a commotion. But of those, we also brought some super smart scientists, some super smart advocates in wheelchairs. The people that weren't like the super smart, but who were like more the advocates that were, gathering attention, there was no sort of bickering for who's gotten more attention or who's better. It was all sort of, everyone works synergistically toward the same end game, getting more money for their disease, getting more money for quality of life issues, stuff like that. It's not as hard as you think when you all have the same end game in sight, when you all have the same goal. And so that's the way we worked it.
Yeah. I guess in some cases, there's a very clear end goal. In some cases, it might be a little less clear, so it might be harder to get the advocates together. I want to ask you this. So, through your work at Pyxis Partners, I know you're on the front lines of public health and research. You work with clients on really complex issues like advancing precision medicine solutions to cancer, reducing stigma in the opioid crisis by advancing medication-assisted treatment, and securing reproductive rights. In each of those cases, I know, and other things that you've worked on in your career, you have to overcome some societal stigma. And I wonder if you could talk about some of the approaches you've found that have been effective at doing that. Because if there's this societal stigma that people don't even want to talk about an issue, or people see that issue as, icky, then it's really hard to make progress. And it seems like a common thread to me of a lot of the things that you've worked on in your career.
Yeah, I'm going to use something I think's a bit analogous. A friend of mine actually was one of the people that was the originator of this idea, which was in the LGBT community, was National Coming Out Day. And I remember the first one, and now we have one every year. And what happened was, what we found, and it has been so true, once someone knows someone who's gay, it changes the way they look at gay, right? Yeah. And so that's what you do, right? You have to make it personal for people, and that helps to reduce stigma, right? So the person next to you might have all those things that scare you, but they're your neighbor. And once you know that they have these things, a little less, you demystify it and you make it just, they're your friend, they're your neighbor, they're your coworker. They're not some, typhoid Mary that's about to. And so I think that's part of it, is just humanizing these issues that are so stigmatizing and making people realize that. And not only is it their neighbor, it could be them, right? And that's what they have to sort of, we try to sort of help them figure that out. It works, I think.
Yeah, I have to share a quick anecdote just based off of that. So I've taught several classes at the George Washington University, and usually when I would introduce myself, I would, say I own a business with my husband, and that's just one of the first things I would say. And I think I kind of knew the importance of just showing up and being an openly out person, but a couple years after one of those classes, I got a Google or just, my name or something that I had set up to monitor. And somebody in a message board at GW posted they were from a small town, they were gay, they wanted to know if GW was going to be a welcoming and affirming community for them. And somebody replied anonymously, a student saying, I had this professor, and in the very first class, he talked about his husband. And it was one of the reasons he thought it was a really affirming community. And it hadn't occurred to me that like the ripple effect of just saying that could do, but there it was. I got a Google alert where somebody's using that as a piece of information to reassure someone. So I think you're right. I think we've all seen examples of the power of just real stories from real people and reminding people that, whether it's your neighbor, a family member, yourself. And I know one of the things that you've done in your career that makes, your work kind of unique and groundbreaking, I would say, is that you've created non-traditional trusted partnerships
Yes.
to help, get voices out there. And I wonder if you could just talk about some of the, some of the examples of how you've gotten disparate groups, or maybe just groups that you wouldn't think of, to work together toward a common goal, or where maybe you've used a messenger that isn't sort of the standard messenger one would think of, but that's been really effective at getting the word out.
Yeah. So for the last 8 years, we've done a big project with the National Institutes of Health called the All of Us Research Program. It was kind of President Obama's signature scientific initiative. And it was to recruit 1 million Americans to enter into a clinic, not a clinical trial per se, but a clinical study. But the difference being, it was not going to be white, straight men, which historically is how all drugs and devices have been developed. Well, I'm not a straight white man. And the woman I walked across the street from is not yet. Everyone is this precision medicine idea is that everyone's so individual, yet you need the data. So anyway, they tasked us with helping to do the recruitment of these 1 million Americans. And we came up with this idea, and this is where this non-traditional stuff became so interesting. You have to go where people live, where they are, right? Because there's so much mistrust of today, particularly of government, of science, of medical research. So we needed these messengers to be people that they truly trusted. Because a white scientist goes into a community and says, I really need Latino men to enter this clinical trial.
Right.
They might as well be just talking to the wall, because nothing's going to happen. But if you form a relationship with the Latino Nurses Association, who see these people all the time, and that nurse says to their person who might be their neighbor, hey, this is really cool clinical study, you might be interested in. I think it's a really good thing. Or we worked with the Divine Nine, of which Vice President Harris is a member. It's the Greek, Black Greek sororities and fraternities, 9 million members strong. We got them to support us. And when they reach out to their community of 9 million alumni, they do what they are asked generally, because they trust the people that are telling them. We worked with YMCAs, right? Because that's where people go. That's where they go to their community. That's where they go swimming. And so it's not about the non-traditional venue or person. It's about the messenger, right? And so it's the messenger they trust. And they generally don't trust I have to be honest, they don't trust scientists, they don't trust doctors particularly, but they trust the people that they see every day.
Yeah.
So that's the kind of thing where it's a bit non-traditional.
I love the Divine Nine example. And, I think it's hard for people to hear sometimes that folks don't trust the person in the white lab coat. I
Nope.
guess I think, from what I've seen in research, right? People generally don't like Congress, but they might like their member of Congress. And
Yes.
people don't necessarily trust, quote, doctors, but they may really trust their doctor. So there's a bit of a,
Yeah.
contradiction there, but going out through other communities, other affiliations that may be atypical, because you wouldn't think, oh, if I want people to sign up for medical research, I should go through their college fraternity. And
Yeah.
yet that was a really effective strategy.
Correct. We've recruited 750,000 people so far, all diverse,
Yeah.
both
That's incredible.
demographically and ethnically. Yeah, it's really amazing. So
I want to also ask about just sort of coalitions. I know that obviously, to influence policy and to make change, there's a lot of coalitions and groups out there that come together. You had a lot of success with the Coalition for the Advancement of Medical Research
yeah,
and getting a variety of organizations to come together. Could you talk a little bit about that? And I know that it was it took some time to get where you wanted to go there, but you were able to keep folks really focused, and I'm really interested in kind of how you kept everybody's attention and kept them focused.
yeah. So that coalition formed. Chris was still alive and Dana was still alive. It was after the discovery of embryonic stem cells. I think most people know about stem cells and sort of leukemia, and you can do a stem cell transplant. But embryonic stem cells were different because they could sort of become anything in the body. And the scientists were saying, once they were discovered, that this could be the cure to everything. But President Bush was in the White House, and because it came from embryos that were going to be discarded from IVF, it became a political issue, right? It became an abortion issue, which it was not, of course. But we thought it might be, and we thought he was going to close the door to the funding. Anyway, we started a small group, it was about 10 of us, Juvenile Diabetes, Harvard, Reeve Foundation, and we built it out to 100 members, including patient advocacy organizations, academic research institutions, scientific membership societies, people that generally all didn't play in the sandbox necessarily ever, but they realized the potential of this form of science. And we successfully kept the door open through President Bush's presidency. We actually passed the Stem Cell Research Enhancement Act in a divided Congress, bipartisan, and both times we passed it, Bush vetoed it, but we still kept the door open. Anyway, we also made these 100 groups. We didn't make them do it, but everyone's got so many competing priorities within their organization, and there's only so much time and effort you can devote to these priorities. But we got each of these organizations to make funding for embryonic stem cell research by the federal government a priority. Number one, number two, maybe number three, but definitely one top three. And that made all the difference. And so we kept the door open. President Obama was elected, and the first executive order he signed was opening the floodgates of federal funding to embryonic stem cell research. We now fund it to a tune of $1 billion a year, and there's so much promise. So,
and I understand
that was a big coalition.
Yeah, and I understand you were like standing in the White House. You were invited to be there when that executive order was signed, and
yes,
I have to like maybe just like take us back to that moment, because again, 15, 20 years before that, you were told you had 18 months to live, and now you've been like fighting for patients using sort of your own lived experience as a way to break through and connect with people. And then you're standing in the White House watching the president of the United States sign an executive order for something you've worked so hard for. I mean, not a lot of people know what that's like. So what's that like?
This is going to sound a little trite, but after I had super sick, and I really didn't think I was going to make it, and then I got on that drug that Dr. Fauci developed, but I tried to sort of, make every day or, live every day like it's your last. And I did an okay job of it, I think. So when I was in the White House, that was the moment. And if that was it, that was my last moment. It was so beyond. But to your point, Anthony, and I thought I was going to get from here to there. No, but I was there. and I deserved to be there. We worked really hard, and it felt very gratifying and it was an honor. And it's always an honor to be in the White House. But, I've been lucky enough. I've been in the White House for a number of times. We then passed the Christopher Dana Reeve Act, and I was in the White House for that. And I was in the White House. I was invited by Obama to be there for World AIDS Day and stood next to Annie Lennox and shook his hand as he was walking down the thing. But each and every time I do it humbly, and I'm grateful that I've had the ability to, even in some small way, influence some change for the good, for the better, and then change policy. So
It probably felt like, this is a once in a lifetime moment.
yes,
Going to White, and then it keeps happening. Wait, I'm back. They're having me back again. So I mean, that's pretty cool that it just shows the persistence you've had. And I want to just maybe close with a question about that. Obviously, the work that you've done over your career has required a lot of persistence, a lot of patience, but not just, for you, for all the people around you, the organizations and the coalitions or the people you're galvanizing. Christopher and Dana Reeve, they didn't live to see their law passed, and the Stem Cell Research Enhancement Act, it passed Congress, but it wasn't signed by the president. You had to wait till another president to get that, as an executive order. So I wonder if you could just kind of close by telling us how you've kept yourself and others going, because when I think about your career, Michael, and sort of how you stand out as an influencer, I wonder if maybe your superpower as an influencer has been to keep hope alive within yourself and within those around you, and that might really be just one of the special abilities that you have that has led to so much of this success.
Yeah, hope is definitely a driving force. I think though more than even hope though is because everything that we've talked about today took a long time, 10 years, 15 years, 20 years from start to sort of hopefully happy conclusion. And what you have to really celebrate along the way are the incremental victories, even if they're small, because that's what keeps you going, right? That gives you the hope. Like I've made those little small victory. I've convinced one member of Congress to support this bill on stem cell research or a bill for the Christopher Dana Reeve Act. And you take the incremental victories, and then when you get the big giant victory, that's when I think you actually need the humility, right? And to be humble, because you work so hard for so long, you celebrate all the incremental victories, and then when the good thing finally happens, you're like, wow. It's you need to be, I think no one should ever be at that point where I deserve it. They should be in awe that they've made it that far. Personally, that's my opinion, but
I think that's really good advice. I think that's good advice for oneself, celebrating those incremental victories to keep going. But it's also really good advice when you're building a team, when you're building a coalition, identifying those incremental victories and finding those moments to celebrate them. That continues to keep the cycle of energy going so that everyone can push forward.
Yep, for sure.
Michael, thank you so much. You are yourself a Superman, as I think everybody has heard. And I hope folks will go out and check out the Superman documentary that's in theaters, or stream the Fauci documentary you're featured in. Go to the Pyxis Partners website and read the Back to Basics report.
Thank you.
I just have to say, I'm really personally inspired by what you've done in your career and all that you've done for patients, but really, people, right? It's not just patients, we're all people. So thanks for taking time to share your story with us today.
Anthony, it has been a pleasure. Thank you so much.
Thank you for joining us for another episode of Chief Influencer, a production of Social Driver and the Communications Board. If you know a leader who should be featured as a chief influencer, please nominate them at chiefinfluencer.org. For show notes and more, visit us at chiefinfluencer.org or follow Chief Influencer on LinkedIn. Until next time.